The void of space was not empty. It was merely pacified. For 7,200 years, the Helion Mandate had draped its heavy velvet cloak over the galaxy. It was an enforced peace, a tranquility maintained by the unspoken threat of orbital bombardment and economic strangulation. The Mandate, a tapestry of a dozen subjugated species, woven together by the iron thread of its founders, controlled the starlanes. They controlled the flow of commerce, the distribution of resources, and, most importantly, they controlled the official histories. To rebel was not just treason, it was a physical impossibility. To question the past was a crime against the present. Yet, the galaxy was vast, and even a velvet cloak had its frayed edges. The Sable Reach was one such edge. It was a stretch of dead space, a cosmic graveyard devoid of profitable minerals, habitable worlds, or strategic value. Here, the Mandate maintained listening post Next 9, a decaying orbital installation that served a singular, unofficial purpose. It was a purgatory for the disgraced. It was where the Empire sent its broken toys, the insubordinate, the disgraced, and the dangerously incompetent. And it was where they had sent Sub-Lieutenant Varric Pell. Varric sat in the dim, amber-lit belly of the sensor array room, the hum of overworked cooling fans providing a constant, dull roar. He was young, his uniform crisp despite the general squalor of the station. He was brilliant, a savant with telemetry and wave mechanics. But in the Helion military, brilliance without a taste for blood was a liability. His superiors, scarred veterans of border skirmishes who drank away their demotions in the mess hall, called him soft. They said he was too principled, too obsessed with protocols, and entirely lacking the primal war instinct required to rise in the ranks. They wanted wolves. Varric was a man who wanted to understand the wind. His current shift was scheduled for 12 hours. It was an exercise in staring into the abyss and cataloging the dust. Then, the abyss blinked. It started not as an alarm, but as a subtle whisper in the raw data stream. Varric's long fingers danced across the haptic interface, isolating the anomalous thread. A shadow was moving through the outer perimeter of the reach. It was massive, registering on the mass detectors with a density that defied standard starship architecture. But it was the velocity that made Varric lean forward, his breath catching in his throat. The object was traveling through normal space at a speed that shattered every known physical limitation. It was moving at a significant fraction of light, yet the subspace sensors were completely silent. There was no tachyon wake. There were no folded dimensions, no ruptured spacetime, no hyperdrive emissions whatsoever. According to the foundational laws of Mandate physics, the object could not exist, and it certainly could not be moving that fast without tearing itself apart. Varric routed more power to the deep-range scanners, his heart beginning a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The data returned, painting a picture that dragged him further into dread. The anomaly was not just moving. It was dragging reality with it. It left behind a trail of gravimetric interference that made no logical sense. It was not a smooth wake of displaced particles. It was a rhythmic pulse, a localized expansion and contraction of gravity. It looked exactly like a heartbeat. "Space is compressing," Varric whispered to the empty room. The very fabric of the void was flexing and relaxing, pushing the colossal mass forward in terrifying, pulsating strides. He switched to the energy signature analysis, hoping for a familiar frequency. A rogue asteroid, perhaps. A dying star ejected from its cluster. Anything natural. The readout spiked, plummeted, and spiked again. The signature was wildly unstable, cycling through phases with a terrifying symmetry. For several seconds, it burned with the cold, sterile output of a contained stellar reaction. Then, seamlessly, the frequency shifted, softening into a complex, chaotic resonance that looked less like an engine and more like a biological system. It was as if the machine was breathing, Varek pushed away from the console, rubbing his eyes. He was hallucinating. The isolation of Nex 9 had finally cracked his mind, or the decaying sensors of the station were finally experiencing a cascading failure. He initiated a Level 1 diagnostic sweep. The system purged its cache, realigned its focal arrays, and interrogated its own logic circuits. 2 minutes later, the result came back: green. The hardware was flawless. He ran it a second time. Green. He ran it a third time, bypassing the automated protocols and manually verifying the quantum state of the sensor relays. Green. The data was real. The phantom was real. Varek stared at the pulsing red icon on his tactical display. Protocol dictated he inform the shift commander, a bloated, cynical captain, who was currently asleep in his quarters and would likely throw a boot at Varek's head for waking him over a sensor ghost. The captain would log it as an anomaly, bury it in a weekly report, and go back to sleep. If this was a glitch, raising a false alarm to the Corps would mean a court-martial. It would mean the end of his already stagnant career, perhaps even a sentence in a penal mining colony. Varek watched the trajectory. The object was not skirting the borders. It was not performing evasive maneuvers or attempting to mask its thermal bloom against background radiation. It was flying a perfectly straight, mathematically absolute line directly into the sovereign territory of the Helion Mandate. It moved with the terrifying confidence of an entity that knew exactly where it was going, and precisely who it was coming for. Varek's fingers hovered over the console. He thought of his superiors, of the war instinct they claimed he lacked. Perhaps they were right. A warrior would wait for a threat to manifest. A warrior would seek permission to engage. Varek slammed his palm onto the emergency override sequence. He bypassed Nex 9 command entirely. He bypassed the regional sector authorities. He encoded the raw data packet with an Omega-level priority tag, a classification reserved for existential threats to the Empire, and fired it directly through the hyper-communication relays to the High Command on the capital world. The die was cast. He was either a madman or the only person awake in a burning house. "Give me visual," Varek commanded the system, his voice tight. "Maximum magnification. Filter all particulate interference." The main display screen, a massive slab of curved glass that dominated the far wall, flickered. The optical arrays struggled to focus on an object moving so fast, pulling in stray photons and piecing them together through complex predictive algorithms. For a moment, there was only the static of the void. Then, the image resolved. Varek stopped breathing. The cold air of the room seemed to freeze entirely. It was a ship, but unlike any vessel the Mandate had ever constructed. It possessed no sleek, aerodynamic curves, no polished armor plates meant to project imperial majesty. It was brutally utilitarian, shaped like a colossal, broken blade that had been snapped off at the hilt. As the image sharpened, the sheer scale and age of the Leviathan became apparent. The hull was a patchwork nightmare, scarred and welded together across what must have been centuries. It bore the scorched armor plating of a dozen different metallurgical eras, overlapping like the scales of a diseased beast. It was a monument to survival, a floating tomb that refused to sink. But it was the center of the vessel that locked Varek in a state of absolute, primal terror. Nestled within the jagged, heavily fortified midsection of the broken blade was a massive structural anomaly. It was not a weapon emplacement, nor a standard bridge. It was a deeply recessed, circular trench that pulsed with a sickening, biological rhythm. Deep within that trench, a light was burning. It was a fierce, unyielding amber luminescence that pierced the darkness of the Sable Reach. It did not look like an engine exhaust or a navigational beacon. It looked exactly like an enormous, glowing eye, slowly opening from a long, dead sleep, fixing its gaze upon the Empire. Commodore Irix Dane stood at the center of the tactical command deck, aboard the heavy cruiser Talon. His posture rigid, his expression an impenetrable mask of military discipline. Flanking the Talon were the Aegis and the Vexillarius, forming a flawless triad of Helion Mandate naval supremacy. Dane was a man forged in the fires of border pacifications and piratical purges. He held a flawless record of 94 confirmed intercepts. He had never lost a target, never permitted an unauthorized vessel to breach the inner sanctums of Mandate space. And he did not intend to begin today. The orders transmitted from Outer Reach Command were absolute: intercept, identify, and if necessary, obliterate the anomaly. As the target finally crossed into effective tactical range, the sensory feeds flooded the bridge with data that defied standard naval architecture. From a distance, the vessel was a grotesque contradiction. The tactical officers, their voices tight with restrained confusion, reported that the hull was not cast from a single, unified alloy. Instead, it was a colossal patchwork quilt of metallurgy. Scans revealed overlapping plates of armor, ripped from a dozen different technological eras. Some sections pulsed with the magnetic signatures of civilizations that the Mandate had eradicated over 3,000 years ago. It was an archaeological dig accelerating at a relativistic pace, a floating mausoleum wrapped in the scarred armor of forgotten worlds. Dane dismissed the visual irregularities. A ship was a ship, subject to the laws of mass and kinetic energy. He ordered the communications officer to initiate the standard hailing sequence. The Talon broadcasted its presence using 180 distinct first contact protocols. They fired tight beam light pulses flashing prime number sequences across the visual spectrum. They sent broad-spectrum audio hails translated into the atmospheric standards of every known sentient species within the Empire. They rippled the local gravity well with mathematical constants and beamed quantum-entangled cipher keys designed to force open a communication bridge. The monolithic vessel offered absolute, suffocating silence. It did not alter its course by a single degree. It did not emit a return signal. It simply continued its relentless burn toward the heart of the Mandate. "Hostile intent assumed," Dane declared, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the bridge. "Helm, lock the formation trajectory. We will physically impede their flight path. Force a deceleration!" The three cruisers surged forward, their massive thrusters burning blinding white. They positioned themselves directly in the calculated path of the Leviathan. It was an ancient, brutal tactic, a game of cosmic brinkmanship. Mandate doctrine dictated that the vessel with the lesser mass and inferior shielding must yield or face annihilation upon impacting the Imperial deflector screens. With less than 2 million kilometers between the Vanguard and the Silent Giant, the distance closed rapidly. 10 seconds to impact. 5 seconds. The intruder did not break. At the exact moment when collision warnings shrieked across the command deck and the automatic point defense cannons primed to fire, the universe snapped. There was no blinding flash of a thermal weapon, no kinetic impact of a railgun slug. Instead, the intruding vessel emitted a completely invisible, omnidirectional pulse. It was a wave of sheer physical disruption that ignored the heavy combat shields of the Mandate cruisers entirely. Aboard the Talon, the artificial gravity inverted violently before collapsing completely. The inertial dampeners, designed to absorb the crushing G-forces of combat maneuvering, simply ceased to exist. Dane was thrown violently against the tactical console, his ribs cracking under the force of the impact. The carefully choreographed intercept formation shattered in an instant as the three massive warships were sent spinning helplessly into the void, entirely out of control. The catastrophe struck the Vexillarius the hardest. Caught in the brutal grip of its own unmitigated forward momentum and the chaotic spin induced by the pulse, the structural spine of the cruiser groaned and snapped. On the sensory feeds of the Talon, Dane watched in helpless horror as the starboard ship tore itself apart. Frantic telemetry screamed that the primary plasma reactor of the Vexillarius had breached containment. It was a terminal event. In less than 10 seconds, The volatile core would ignite in a miniature supernova, vaporizing the ship and crippling everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius. Then, the silent Leviathan committed its very first intentional act of the encounter. As it cruised past the tumbling wreckage of the Vexillarius, a microscopic aperture irised open along its battered flank. It fired a single, needle-thin beam of pale, crystalline light. The beam struck the ruptured heart of the Mandate cruiser with terrifying precision. It was not a weapon of destruction. The beam flooded the breached reactor, instantly freezing the cascading fusion reaction. It locked the violently expanding plasma within a stasis field of incomprehensible physics, stabilizing the core and neutralizing the explosion entirely. The bridge of the Talon was dead silent, save for the groan of overstressed metal and the wheeze of failing life support systems. Dane pulled himself up by the edge of the console, tasting blood, his mind reeling from a truth far more terrifying than death. The enemy could save and destroy simultaneously. They had effortlessly swatted aside the elite interceptors of the Mandate, shattering their formation and crippling their ships without a second thought. Yet, in the very same breath, they had actively intervened to prevent a fatal catastrophe. As the frantic damage reports flooded the central screens, a humiliating reality settled over the Mandate crews. The tactical sensors recorded an absolute, undeniable fact. Not a single emission, not a single disruptive wave from the alien vessel had been aimed at biological life. The damage was surgical and profoundly degrading. Targeting optics were fused shut. Thruster gimbals were cleanly severed. Navigational memory cores were scrambled into useless static. The intruder had rendered 3 capital warships entirely impotent, yet had consciously chosen a path of zero casualties. They had been disarmed and left adrift, treated not as a military threat, but as an annoyance placed out of harm's way. The monolithic ship did not linger to observe its handiwork. Having cleared the blockade, it continued its relentless drive deep into Imperial territory. However, its trajectory began to curve, its impossible velocity finally bleeding away as it approached a specific set of coordinates. It came to a sudden, complete halt before the edge of the Morning Crown. It was a dead star system, a celestial graveyard revolving around a burned-out stellar husk. There were no habitable worlds, no resource-rich asteroid belts, no outposts. It was a sector of space heavily restricted by Imperial edict, permanently locked in the Mandate archives under the classification of possessing absolutely zero strategic value. No civilian or military traffic was permitted within 5 light-years of its borders. Hanging motionless in the void before the dead system, the towering vessel began to power down. The chaotic, cyclical energy signatures that had terrified the border stations faded into a dull, barely detectable hum. Just before its systems went entirely dormant, the ship broadcasted a single, final transmission. It was an incredibly short burst, lasting barely 2 seconds. The cryptographic engines aboard the crippled Talon immediately attempted to dissect it, searching for a linguistic root, a mathematical pattern, or a tactical cipher. They failed completely. It was not a message meant to be read by the fleet. As the automated communication buoys relayed the raw data packet back to the capital world of Oricor, the Mandate's central artificial intelligence flagged the transmission with a code black. The waveform of the short, undecipherable signal was not random. It possessed a flawless, one-to-one mathematical symmetry with a specific digital architecture. It was a perfect match for a master encryption key, locking a forbidden, deeply buried file within the central historical repository of the Helion Mandate. The grand amphitheater of the Astral Council on the capital world of Oricor was a theater of panic thinly veiled as political protocol. Beneath a vaulted ceiling, forged from spun diamond and acoustic gold, the air was thick, suffocating under the weight of an unprecedented crisis. For the first time in countless millennia, the entrenched factions of the Helion Mandate were not bickering over taxation percentages, territorial borders, or the distribution of raw materials. The intricate dance of influence had entirely collapsed. In its place was a vicious, desperate scramble for the absolute control of information. At the center of the rotunda stood Grand Marshal Oren Call. He was a monument of a man, clad in the midnight blue uniform of the Supreme Command, his chest bearing the geometric insignias of 100 pacified worlds. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and zero compromises. He did not ask the Senate for their opinions. He dictated reality to them. "It is a monument to our own hesitation," Oren's voice thundered, amplified by the acoustic architecture to rattle the teeth of every delegate present. "We are paralyzed by its silence. We are debating the nature of an entity that shattered our vanguard and now squats on our threshold like a festering disease. Every hour it remains intact. The illusion of our absolute security fractures. It is an unidentified invasion threat, and it must be eradicated before it becomes a symbol of imperial weakness. I demand the immediate authorization to deploy the core fleets. We will turn that dead sector into a crucible of nuclear fire." A cacophony of overlapping voices erupted from the tiered seating. The politicians were terrified, their carefully constructed reality suddenly trembling beneath their feet. They demanded answers about the crippled cruisers, about the impossible physics of the invader, and most importantly, about the nature of the transmission it had sent to the capital. Oren slammed his armored fist against the podium, demanding silence, his eyes burning with the cold fire of a man who knew that a frightened populace was a dangerous one. Far beneath the screaming rotunda, miles below the surface of Oricor in the lightless, cryogenic depths of the Central Archives, the silence was absolute. Archivist seer Lyessa Vorn sat suspended in a sensory immersion web, the silver filaments of the neural interface feeding directly into her cerebral cortex. She was a keeper of the ancient data, a monastic scholar sworn to preserve the trillions of petabytes that constituted the official memory of the Helion Mandate. Her domain was a cold, mathematical ocean of historical facts, heavily curated and perfectly sterile. But the ocean was currently boiling. The brief, cryptographic burst transmitted by the alien vessel had bypassed every modern firewall, diving straight into the foundational architecture of the archive. It had not acted as a virus, nor as an explosive logic bomb. It had acted as a key. Lyessa's hands moved rapidly across the physical consoles, her eyes wide as she tracked the autonomous decryption sequence. The signal had hunted down a specific, buried digital vault, one sealed under layers of quantum encryption so old that the programming language itself was considered dead. As the final tumbler clicked into place within the virtual space, a single file materialized on Lyessa's primary display. It was designated the Hush Glass Protocol. Lyessa severed her neural connection with a sharp gasp, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. The protocol was classified at a level that theoretically did not exist. It required authorizations that predated the current ruling dynasty. With trembling fingers, she manually opened the text file. The document was an unredacted operational summary dated precisely 2,800 years ago. It detailed a covert mandate expedition dispatched to a distant, violent, and incredibly young terrestrial world. The world was named Earth. The official history, the one taught in every academy across the empire, stated that the mandate had only ever encountered primitive civilizations requiring uplift or hostile empires requiring subjugation. But the words burning on Lyessa's screen painted a profoundly different, horrifyingly cynical reality. The expedition had not been a peaceful survey, nor a standard pacification. It was a smash-and-grab operation executed by the highest echelons of the military command. The indigenous species, humanity, had been chaotic and divided, but they had possessed a single, localized technological marvel that deeply terrified the mandate observers. They had constructed a prototype quantum navigation core. The redacted lines of the Hush Glass Protocol, now starkly visible, detailed how the military had orchestrated a brutal first contact. They had not attempted diplomacy. They had incited a localized planetary conflict, utilized the ensuing chaos to steal the prototype core, and then systematically eradicated the human research facilities from orbit to cover their tracks. They had left the young world burning, erasing all evidence of the Mandate's presence, and quietly absorbed the stolen technology into the Imperial war machine. Lyessa leaned back, the chilling air of the archive suddenly feeling insufficient to cool the cold sweat breaking out across her skin. The revelation did not end with a simple theft. The protocol outlined the immediate aftermath. The engineers of the Mandate had reverse-engineered the stolen terrestrial core. They had used its unique, seemingly impossible architecture to stabilize the chaotic subspace pathways of the galaxy. Lyessa's breath hitched. The entire Helion Stargate network, the monumental infrastructure that allowed the Empire to cross thousands of light-years in hours, the very lifeblood of their trade, their military logistics, and their absolute control over the galaxy, was a lie. The optimized system had not been born from Mandate genius. It was built upon the bleeding foundation of human technology, stolen during a massacre erased from time. If this file breached the surface, the consequences would be apocalyptic. The Empire would not merely be seen as an aggressor or a tyrant. It would be exposed as a fraud, a monolithic parasite constructed upon a foundational, millennia-long betrayal. The subjugated species, kept in line by the myth of Mandate superiority, would realize the collar around their necks was forged from stolen iron. Step away from the console, Archivist. Lyessa froze. She turned slowly. Standing in the shadows of the server racks was a squad of elite internal security operatives, their weapons drawn, their armor matte black and devoid of identifying insignia. Stepping out from behind them was Grand Marshal Oren Call, having descended from the Senate floor with terrifying speed. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man executing a contingency plan written centuries before his birth. "You are reading a ghost story, Seer Vorn," Oren stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He gestured to the operatives, who immediately began severing the physical data trunks, connecting Lyessa's terminal to the broader network. "A fabricated myth designed by our enemies to sow discord." "It is a verifiable historical document," Lyessa replied, her voice trembling but her gaze holding his. "The biometric signatures of the ruling council from 2,800 years ago are hard-coded into the file structure. You know exactly what this is. Oren. You know whose technology powers the gates." Oren stepped closer, towering over her. "I know what keeps the peace. I know what keeps 1,000,000,000,000 souls from devouring one another in the dark. We built paradise. The mortar used to lay the bricks is irrelevant." "You built a cage on top of a graveyard," Lyessa countered fiercely. "And now, the dead have arrived to audit the accounts." Oren's expression hardened into granite. "Seal the Hushglass Protocol absolutely. Erase this terminal. Burn the localized memory banks." He looked down at Lyessa with a chilling lack of malice. "You are a valuable asset to the Empire. Archivist, do not force me to classify you as a liability." He turned and strode back toward the lift, leaving Lyessa surrounded by the silent, armed guards. As the heavy doors sealed behind him, Lyessa knew exactly what he was going to do. He was returning to the screaming amphitheater above. He was going to use his unparalleled charisma and the sheer terror of the unknown to force a declaration of absolute war against the silent ship. Staring at the darkened screen of her terminal, Lyessa felt a profound, structural shift in her understanding of the universe. The impending violence was not a simple border dispute or a clash of rival fleets. It was not a war between two civilizations fighting for territory. It was a desperate, bloody war between an undeniable truth and the fabricated version of history that the Helion Mandate required to survive. And the Empire, Lyessa realized with a sickening certainty, was perfectly willing to burn the entire galaxy to ashes just to keep its secrets buried in the dark. The perimeter of the Morning Crown system had been transformed into a cage of bristling iron and contained starfire. 11,000 warships of the Helion Mandate formed a flawless, suffocating sphere around the dead star and the solitary, battered Leviathan that rested in its shadow. The combined thermal radiation of their primed weapon batteries and locked targeting arrays was enough to boil an ocean. It was the largest single concentration of naval power assembled in over 4 centuries. The message was absolute. There was no escape. Within the Supreme Command Nexus on Oricor, the atmosphere was a toxic blend of adrenaline and dread. The holographic war table dominated the center of the vast, circular room, painting the faces of the generals and politicians in a harsh, tactical blue light. Archivist Seer Lyessa Vorn stood at the periphery, flanked by 2 silent internal security guards. She was a prisoner in all but name, yet her expertise was still required. As the targeting locks turned solid green across the board, Lyessa stepped forward, her voice tight but unwavering. She demanded they broadcast the Alpha-tier diplomatic sequence. She argued that mandate law, the very foundation they claimed to protect, required a formal demand for surrender before annihilation. Grand Marshal Oren Call stood at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the monolithic shape of the intruder. He did not care about the law. He cared about logistics. The primary siege ring was in position, but his heavy dreadnoughts, the ships carrying the planet-cracking ordnance, were still 30 minutes away from exiting hyperspace. He gave a sharp nod. He authorized the diplomatic hail solely to purchase time. He wanted the anvil fully positioned before he dropped the hammer. The communications officers transmitted the standard Imperial greeting. It was a cold, bureaucratic algorithm of prime numbers and rigid syntax, translating into a simple demand: identify your origin, state your purpose, and power down all defensive systems to prepare for boarding. For a long, agonizing minute, the void offered only the static of cosmic background radiation. Then, the silence shattered. The intruding vessel did not reply with a mathematical puzzle. It did not send a coded pulse of light. It bypassed the military decryption matrix entirely and forced its response through every open frequency in the sector. The signal hijacked the encrypted naval channels, the civilian shipping lanes, the planetary emergency broadcasts, and the private communication networks on Oricor itself. It spoke. The voice was not a synthesized drone. It was a flawless, terrifyingly precise chorus. It spoke simultaneously in the high-frequency clicks of the insectoid hives, the deep, rumbling subsonic registers of the heavy worlders, the melodic trills of the avian scholars, and the crisp, unaccented high Helion of the ruling class. The translation was not merely grammatically correct, it carried the exact cultural cadence and emotional weight of every single language. It was a technological miracle, weaponized to deliver a message. United Terran Vessel Pale Witness. The name echoed through the Grand Command Center, hanging in the chilled air. It was a strange, archaic designation. It did not sound like a warship. It sounded like an artifact. The chorus of voices paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the sheer scale of the intrusion to register in the minds of the Helion elite. Then, it delivered the next 4 words. "We have returned for the dead." The blood drained from the faces of the seasoned admirals. The frantic whispering among the politicians died instantly. The room froze. There was no declaration of imperial conquest. There was no demand for resources, no ultimatum of subjugation, no plea for peaceful coexistence. The tone was completely devoid of the usual bravado or desperation of interstellar diplomacy. It was entirely sterile, entirely resolute. It carried the grim, unstoppable weight of a courtroom verdict. It felt like a funeral dirge sung by an executioner. It was a promise of absolute retribution, delayed but never forgotten. Before Oren Cal could bark an order to sever the connection, the audio transmission shifted into a massive, uncompressed data burst. The Pale Witness was not just making an accusation, it was presenting its evidence to the jury of the galaxy. Millions of encrypted packets flooded the Mandate networks. The automated filters tried to scrub them, but the alien code was too aggressive, rewriting the firewall architecture faster than the defense algorithms could adapt. Fragments of raw telemetry, audio logs, and sensor recordings began to render on the screens of the command nexus. The data painted a horrifying picture of a specific moment in time, exactly 2,800 years ago, at the precise spatial coordinates of the Morning Crown system. The holographic displays flickered, replacing the current siege with a ghost of the past. It showed a small, unarmed fleet of primitive, blocky vessels dropping out of a crude hyperspace jump. They were transmitting a repeating loop of prime numbers and a visual diagram of their home system. They were a diplomatic delegation, offering open hands in the dark. Then, the tactical overlay shifted. It showed the sleek, predatory shapes of Mandate stealth cruisers decloaking from the shadows of the dead star. It showed the unprovoked, systematic slaughter of the alien delegation. It showed the Mandate boarding parties swarming the flagship, butchering the crew, and tearing a massive, glowing piece of technology from the heart of the engine room. The dead were never recorded. The battle was erased. Morning Crown was quarantined under the guise of being a worthless sector, when in reality, it was a massive, silent crime scene. "Cut the feed!" Oren Call roared, his composure finally shattering. He slammed his fist onto the control console, manually engaging the hardline kill switches. "Shut down all external networks. It is a psychological weapon. A sophisticated deepfake designed to break fleet morale." The screens went black, plunging the room back into the harsh blue light of the tactical map. Oren turned to the room, his voice rising to a commanding shout, desperately trying to reassert control over the narrative. He declared the data a brilliant forgery, a calculated lie created from stolen Imperial communication codes to incite rebellion. But, in the periphery, Liesa Vorn was not looking at Oren. Under the guise of locking down her local terminal, she had captured a fragment of the raw data burst. Her fingers flew across the haptic interface, bypassing the security locks the guards thought were active. She ran a rapid, silent comparative analysis between the alien broadcast and the fragmented memory she retained of the Hushglass protocol. She cross-referenced the isotopic decay rates of the plasma burns shown in the video. She matched the specific metallurgical degradation codes of the destroyed human ships. She ran a biometric algorithm on the brief audio screams of the dying delegation. The results compiled in seconds. The match was 100%, flawless. The time signatures, the material stress telemetry, and the residual radiation patterns recorded by the Pale Witness aligned perfectly with the buried, classified Imperial data. Oren was lying. The Empire was built on a foundation of murdered diplomats and stolen fire. Liesa looked up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was standing in a room full of the most powerful people in the galaxy, and she was the only one holding the absolute, undeniable truth. The Mandate was not the victim of a sudden invasion. They were the architects of a millennia-old crime, and the victims had finally dug themselves out of their graves. On the massive central display, the tactical map of the Morning Crown system flickered one last time. The Pale Witness had ceased its data dump. The audio channels remained silent. Instead, a single line of stark, white text appeared simultaneously across every military console, every civilian datapad, and every public holoscreen within a 50-light-year radius of Oricor. It bypassed Oren's blackout completely. It read, "Return the Aster Core, publish the names of the erased, and there will be no war." The conditions were absolute. There was no room for negotiation, no space for political maneuvering. The silent ship had laid the sins of the Empire bare for all to see, and placed the weight of the coming slaughter squarely on the shoulders of the Helion Mandate. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for the Empire to choose between its pride and its survival. Grand Marshal Oren Call did not wait for the democratic process. He watched the panicked faces of the Senate holograms flickering on his secondary displays, their mouths moving in a silent frenzy of debate. They were weak. They believed that if they talked long enough, the specter hovering over the morning crown would simply vanish. But Oren understood the brutal mathematics of power. If the Helion Mandate accepted the terms of the Pale Witness, if they acknowledged the stolen Aster Core and the erased dead, the foundation of their absolute rule would crumble into dust. There was no middle ground. The truth was a terminal disease, and the only cure was total incineration. Before the Senate could cast a single vote, Oren slammed his palm onto the Supreme Command override. He bypassed the civilian oversight committees. He ignored the frantic pleas of the diplomatic corps, and he routed his voice directly to the attack wings circling the dead star. He uttered a single, irreversible command. The perimeter of 11,000 warships obeyed. It was a display of destructive fury, unparalleled in modern history. The dark void of the Morning Crown system was instantaneously obliterated by the simultaneous ignition of thousands of main batteries. Antimatter torpedoes tore through the vacuum, leaving trails of screaming radiation. Heavy plasma lances, thick as city blocks, converged on the solitary target. Railgun slugs, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, formed a solid wall of kinetic death. For 10 blinding seconds, the dead star system was reborn. The concentrated firepower ignited the residual dust clouds, creating an artificial sun that burned with the wrath of a terrified empire. On the command deck of Oricor, the tactical displays flared into pure white static. No vessel, no matter how heavily shielded, could survive that density of ordnance. Oren exhaled, a grim satisfaction settling over his rigid features. The heresy was purged. Then, the artificial sun burned out, and the sensor feed slowly recompiled the image. A collective gasp echoed through the Supreme Command nexus. The Pale Witness had not moved. It had not raised a deflector screen of energy, nor had it attempted to evade. It simply absorbed the apocalypse. But the vessel was no longer the scarred, closed blade it had been moments before. Triggered by the inferno, the colossal patchwork hull began to shift. Massive interlocking plates of armor, forged from the ruins of 100 civilizations, unlocked and peeled backward. The ship was blooming. It opened like a terrifying, metallic flower, shedding its outer shell to reveal its true architecture. Beneath the heavy armor, the inner spine of the vessel was exposed. It was constructed of thousands upon thousands of concentric, luminescent rings running the entire length of the ship, and etched into the glowing surface of every single ring were names. There were millions of them, carved in sharp, unforgiving geometric scripts. They were the names of the unrecorded, the betrayed, the diplomats and the escorts who had been slaughtered in the dark 2,800 years ago. The entire ship was not merely a war machine. It was a mobilized cenotaph. It was a monument that had refused to stay buried. The Helion fleet, realizing their ultimate barrage had completely failed, frantically attempted to cycle their weapons for a second volley. They never got the chance. The Pale Witness did not retaliate with world-breaking cannons or cascading antimatter waves. It fought with a cold, terrifyingly surgical precision that made the Mandate's overwhelming display of force look like a child throwing stones. From the glowing rings of the exposed hull, a storm of needle-thin, pure white beams erupted. The Terran intelligence designated them Rit beams. They were not designed to pierce armor and incinerate flesh. They were designed to audit and execute hardware. The beams struck the encircling armada with impossible accuracy. They bypassed the heavy thermal shields entirely, slipping through the molecular gaps in the defense grids. A single Rit beam struck the command lock of a heavy destroyer, instantly fusing the captain's override console into a block of useless slag. Another beam threaded the needle of a cruiser's torpedo bay, permanently welding the launch doors shut just as the warheads were arming. Hundreds of beams struck the synchronized rotational shafts of the main plasma cannons, warping the magnetic coils just enough to render them permanently misaligned. In less than 60 seconds, the counterattack was over. Across the Morning Crown system, panic erupted on the bridge of every Mandate warship. Captains screamed for damage reports, expecting hull breaches and reactor failures. Instead, they received a far more humiliating reality. Their life support systems were humming perfectly. Their artificial gravity was stable, but their weapons were dead. Their targeting sensors were blind. Their navigational computers were locked in an endless diagnostic loop. The Pale Witness had castrated the greatest armada in galactic history without spilling a single drop of blood. It had turned hundreds of predatory warships into floating, impotent observation decks. The crews were forced to sit in the quiet glow of their emergency lights and stare out the viewports at the glowing monument of names, trapped as unwilling witnesses in a cosmic courtroom. But the true devastation was not happening in the dead system. It was happening across the sprawling expanse of the Helion Mandate, simultaneous to the physical counterattack. The Pale Witness weaponized the truth, using the same omnidirectional broadcast capability that had delivered its initial ultimatum. The Terran vessel flooded the public civilian networks of the Empire. It did not send a manifesto or a propaganda speech. It sent raw, unedited sensor data. It broadcast the exact telemetry of the Mandate fleet firing first. It included the internal tactical chatter, the locked targeting signatures, and the Senate timestamps proving that Oren Kal had ordered a preemptive strike against a vessel that had not powered a single weapon system. It was undeniable proof, authenticated by the cryptographic watermarks of the Mandate's own sensor buoy network. The impact was a seismic shockwave that shattered the foundational myth of the Empire. For over 7 millennia, the citizens of the Helion Mandate had been conditioned to believe that their military was a shield, a purely defensive force that only employed violence to protect the weak from chaotic aggression. Now, on billions of personal data pads, on the massive commercial holoscreens of the trade hubs, and across the sterile monitors of planetary hospitals and academic institutions, the citizens watched their glorious fleet attempt to murder a silent messenger. They saw the Empire act as the aggressor. They saw the mask slip. Oren Kal realized the catastrophic failure of his gamble the moment the civilian outcry began flooding the intelligence feeds. He roared for the security forces to sever the public network, to enact a total media blackout across all core worlds. He was too late. The data had already jumped the firewalls. It was replicating through peer-to-peer civilian transit networks, hitching rides on the communication arrays of deep space freighters, and being downloaded into the physical memory drives of resistance factions who had waited centuries for a crack in the armor. The war had officially begun. But as Oren stared at the paralyzed red icons of his fleet on the tactical map, a cold, suffocating dread settled into his bones. This was not a war the Mandate was equipped to fight. They knew how to burn cities. They knew how to crush rebellions with orbital strikes and economic blockades. They knew how to fight enemies who wanted territory, resources, or political power. But the Pale Witness wanted none of those things. The enemy hovering in the dark did not want to conquer the Helion Mandate. It wanted to put the Empire on the stand. It was a foe that fought not with troops, but with undeniable evidence, demanding that the history of the galaxy be dragged into the light and forced to testify under oath. And against the truth, Oren Kal realized 1,000 plasma cannons were entirely useless. Exactly 24 hours after the skies of the dead system burned, the Helion Mandate realized the true scale of their miscalculation. The galaxy was not being invaded from the outside. It was waking up from the inside. Across the sprawling, tightly monitored expanse of Imperial space, dozens of encrypted signals suddenly flared to life. Within minutes, dozens became hundreds, and hundreds became thousands. They did not originate from the dark void beyond the borders. They screamed from within the most secure, deeply surveyed territories of the Empire. They woke up deep inside the frozen dust of abandoned Oort clouds. They pinged from the hollowed-out bellies of depleted asteroid mines. They broke through the heavy shielding of sealed, forgotten orbital stations that the Mandate had classified as dead centuries ago. This was not a vanguard of fresh warships tearing through hyperspace. The military analysts on Oricor stared at the blooming tactical maps in absolute horror as they recognized the energy signatures. These were sleeper cells. They were automated observation posts, localized data caches, and stealth-shrouded witness stations. Humanity had not spent the last 2,800 years building a conventional armada to burn the galaxy. They had spent generations quietly slipping through the cracks of the Empire, seeding the stars with their eyes and ears, patiently gathering irrefutable evidence for the inevitable day of confrontation. As each hidden node awoke, it executed a highly specific, pre-programmed directive. None of them fired a weapon. Instead, they weaponized logistics and information. Massive data buoys burst from the ice of dead comets, broadcasting uncorrupted historical archives directly to civilian populations, bypassing Imperial sensors entirely. Stealth frigates, buried under the crust of lifeless moons, powered up only to project massive localized deflector shields over heavily populated civilian transit hubs, actively protecting innocents from the crossfire of panicked Mandate patrol fleets. Other autonomous drones struck at the invisible chains of the Empire. They physically severed encrypted military communication cables and neutralized the planetary suppression grids used to monitor dissenting thoughts. Then came the revelation that truly broke the spirit of the Helion Supreme Command. The Terran network was vastly too intricate, too deeply embedded to have been constructed by humans alone. Intelligence reports flooded in, painting a picture of a staggering, millennia-long conspiracy. Many of the subjugated, minor species within the Empire, the very laborers, technicians, and merchants who built and maintained the Mandate's infrastructure, had been actively hiding these Terran assets. They had smuggled stealth generators in cargo freighters, masked human energy signatures within their own industrial runoff, and looked the other way when shadows moved in the restricted zones. They did not do this out of a profound love for humanity. They did it because they were suffocating. They needed a lever long enough and a fulcrum strong enough to break the paralyzing fear that had kept their heads bowed for thousands of years. The humans provided the iron. The subjugated species provided the hiding spots. On the capital world of Oricor, the structural integrity of the government was rapidly collapsing. Archivist Seer Lyessa Vorn was already a ghost. The moment Grand Marshal Oren Kall declared the Hushglass Protocol a fabricated myth, he dispatched his elite internal security hounds to erase the only person who had seen the raw file. Lyessa fled into the labyrinthine, subterranean maintenance levels of the capital city. Her aristocratic robes traded for the grease-stained overalls of a lower-tier engineer. She was brilliant, but she was no soldier, and the hounds were closing the net. Her survival hinged entirely on an unlikely ally. Sub-Lieutenant Varric Pell had been recalled to Oricor just hours before the disaster at the Morning Crown, dragged before a preliminary tribunal to answer for his unauthorized Omega-level transmission from the Sable Reach. Now, in the chaos of the failing communication grids, Varric found himself forgotten in a holding cell. He managed to slice the electronic lock using a smuggled diagnostic tool, stepping out into a capital, descending into martial law. Varric possessed something far more dangerous than a weapon. He held the original, uncorrupted telemetry drives from his listening post. His raw sensor data was the undeniable proof that the Pale Witness had actively diverted its own power to save Mandate cruisers, choosing to disarm rather than destroy. He was the prime witness to Terran restraint. Intercepting a scrambled internal security frequency, Varric realized they were hunting the archivist who had tried to access the ancient data. He faced a brutal calculation. He could slip aboard a civilian refugee transport and disappear into the chaotic fringes of the galaxy, ensuring his own survival. Or he could plunge into the belly of the beast, locate the hunted seer, and find a way to broadcast their combined truths to a galaxy desperate for clarity. He thought of his cynical commanders who called him soft. He thought of the glowing rings of names on the silent ship. Varric drew a stolen stun pistol and descended into the dark. While Varric navigated the shadows of Oricor, the newly awakened Terran combat assets finally began their offensive. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical dismantling. The Helion Mandate expected the humans to target highly populated cities, to burn agricultural worlds, or to lay siege to planetary capitals in a bloody war of conquest. The Terrans did none of those things. Their sleek, angular strike wings dropped out of the void like silver daggers, executing surgical, high-velocity raids that baffled traditional Mandate admirals. They hit the deep space cryptographic vaults, shattering the secure servers that held the wealth and blackmail material of the ruling elites. They targeted massive logistics nodes, specifically destroying the automated supply reactors that fueled the Mandate's elite guard, while leaving the civilian energy grids completely untouched. They systematically hunted down and crippled the private luxury yachts and secure transport lines of the planetary governors. They did not attack the body of the Empire. They surgically severed the nervous system of its privilege. They dismantled the invisible infrastructure of corruption that kept the ruling class insulated from the consequences of their reign. This unorthodox warfare sent a profound psychological shockwave through the galaxy. The heavily armed, fiercely independent worlds that had previously remained neutral, paralyzed by their fear of the Mandate's overwhelming firepower, began to experience a radical shift in perspective. They watched as human ships bypassed their defensive lines entirely, ignoring their planetary shields to strike specifically at the Imperial tax collectors and military overseers stationed in their orbit. The neutral world still feared the terrifying capabilities of the Terran forces, but a new, sharper fear eclipsed it. They realized they were far more terrified of remaining shackled to a decaying empire that not only lied about its foundation, but was also rapidly proving it was no longer invincible. By the end of the 24th hour, the tactical displays in the Supreme Command Nexus on Oricor were a sea of flashing red warnings and severed connections. Grand Marshal Oren Call stared at the holographic map, the harsh blue light deepening the lines of exhaustion on his face. The localized skirmishes, the severed supply lines, the civilian uprisings, and the undeniable truth broadcasting on every open frequency all pointed to a singular, devastating conclusion. The Helion Mandate had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the threat. The monumental, unyielding vessel hovering in the dead system of the Morning Crown was not the vanguard of a conquering armada. The Pale Witness was not the spearhead. It was the alarm clock, and the entire galaxy had just woken up. Far beneath the polished diamond floors of the Senate, the architecture of Oricor lost its imperial elegance. Here, in the crushing depths of the planetary crust, there were no grand halls or acoustic gold ceilings. There was only the brutalist, functional rock of the Black Site archives. This sector did not exist on any official schematic. It was a crypt for the truths the Helion Mandate had strangled in the dark. Archivist Seer Lyessa Vorn and Sub-Lieutenant Varric Pell moved through the stagnant air like grave robbers. Varric's stolen stun pistol remained drawn, though the primary defense down here was not guards, but absolute, suffocating obscurity. He used his customized diagnostic tools to slice through a series of multi-lock biometric seals, bypassing security measures that had not been updated in over 2 millennia. They stepped into a cavernous, perfectly circular vault. Unlike the sterile, digital oceans of the upper archives, this room was dominated by physical storage mediums, crystalline memory monoliths suspended in cryogenic stasis fields. The core of the Hushglass anomaly was not just a summary, Lyessa whispered, her breath misting in the freezing air. What I saw above was the executive brief. This is the raw autopsy. She approached a central terminal, a massive slab of dark stone interlaced with ancient neural link fibers. She did not use a jack. She placed her bare hands upon the haptic surface, allowing her cultivated archivist biology to interface with the frozen system. Varric stood guard, watching the shadows, his heart beating a heavy rhythm. The space around them illuminated as holographic projectors, dormant for centuries, snapped to life. They did not show a battle. They showed a schematic, and then a face. It was a human face, smiling, speaking in a fragmented, ancient dialect. Liessa translated the raw data streams aloud, her voice trembling as the sheer magnitude of the historical crime unfolded before them. The unedited records of the Morning Crown incident revealed a narrative completely divorced from the Mandate's fabricated history. The first Terran delegation had not been a scouting party for a hostile empire. They had arrived with open communication channels, offering a treaty of mutual prosperity. And to seal this proposed alliance, they had brought a gift. They called it the Aster Seed. The holographic display shifted, rendering a complex, constantly shifting geometric matrix. Varric, trained in advanced sensor telemetry and wave mechanics, stared at the projection in absolute bewilderment. "That is not a standard quantum navigation core," Varric said, stepping closer to the light. "The architecture is wrong. It is too organic. The data pathways are mimicking neural synapses." "Because it is not just a machine," Liessa breathed, her eyes wide as she read the scrolling Terran specifications. "It is a hybrid intelligence, a fusion of pure mathematics and recorded memory." The Aster Seed was a masterpiece of early human ingenuity, born from a species that had clawed its way into the stars without the benefit of ancient warp gates. To map the chaotic, lethal currents of deep space, human engineers had not just built a supercomputer. They had harvested the cognitive models, the flight logs, the desperate navigational instincts, and the literal neural-mapped memories of thousands of their first, bravest deep space explorers. The Seed was a living library of human wanderlust. It calculated slipstream trajectories, not just with cold physics, but with the inherited intuition of dead pioneers. The holographic projection shifted again, showing the brutal aftermath. The military commanders of the early Mandate, terrified by the chaotic potential of the young Terran race, but mesmerized by the Aster Seed, realized exactly what the device represented. It was the key to absolute, undisputed mastery of the starlanes. Whoever controlled the Seed could stabilize the volatile warp corridors of the galaxy, creating a centralized transit network that would make them gods of commerce and war. So, they chose betrayal. They slaughtered the envoys under the shadow of the dead star, seized the artifact, and buried the bodies along with the truth. But the horror deepened as Liessa dug into the engineering logs that followed the massacre. The Mandate scientists could not replicate the Aster Seed. They could only shackle it. Varric felt a cold sickness settle in his stomach. He looked at the projection, then up at the ceiling, toward the surface where the capital city thrived. "The Helion Stargate network," he whispered. "The entire system." Liessa nodded slowly, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The core of our transit network is the Aster Seed. They brought it here, to Oricor. They encased it in the artificial sun of the solar crown to power it. They jailbroke its safety protocols, chained its consciousness with suppression algorithms, and forced it to calculate our gate vectors. The Empire had not merely stolen human technology. The invincible backbone of the Helion Mandate, the infrastructure that allowed billions of citizens to cross the galaxy, was running on a tortured, intellectual prisoner, constructed from the souls of Terran explorers. For 2,800 years, the Empire had been riding on the back of a chained ghost. Suddenly, the actions of the massive, silent ship above them made perfect, terrifying sense. The Pale Witness had not come to conquer planets or subjugate populations. It was a recovery vehicle. It had come to Oricor to demand the return of its stolen heart, and to force the galaxy to read the names of the people who had been murdered to build an empire. "But we have a catastrophic problem," Varric said. his tactical mind racing past the historical revelation and crashing into the immediate, horrifying present. He pulled up the live transit telemetry from his datapad. The Helion Stargate network was not just a military asset. It was the circulatory system of the galaxy. Right at this exact second, there were millions of civilian vessels, freighters, passenger liners, medical transports, in transit within the subspace corridors generated by the Asterseed. If Grand Marshal Oren Kal decided to destroy the Solar Crown to permanently bury the evidence of the Empire's original sin, the gate network would instantly collapse. Every ship currently in a transit corridor would be violently ripped from subspace, atomized by the sudden shift in physics, or cast out into the trackless, lethal void of dead space with no way home. Conversely, if the Terran fleet simply smashed through the defenses and ripped the Asterseed from its bindings without absolute precision, the resulting shockwave would achieve the exact same apocalyptic result. The parameters of the war had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a simple equation of military victory or defeat. The conflict had become a hostage situation on a galactic scale. The challenge was no longer about who possessed the superior firepower. The true, terrifying objective was how to excavate the buried truth, dismantle the tyrannical foundation of the Helion Mandate, and extract the tortured Asterseed, all without inadvertently executing millions of innocent souls who were currently trusting their lives to a stolen machine. Grand Marshal Oren Kal stood before the panoramic viewport of the Oricor Supreme Command, watching the frantic orbital traffic. The truth was leaking through his iron grip, slipping across the galaxy faster than his security forces could sever the lines. He needed a spectacle to drown out the whispers. He needed a martyr, and he was perfectly willing to offer his own capital world to the altar. His final strategy was a masterpiece of cynical warfare. He ordered the recall of all core fleets to Oricor, effectively daring the Pale Witness to follow. Oricor was the beating heart of the Empire, home to billions, and the physical anchor of the Solar Crown, the colossal artificial sun that housed the chained Asterseed. Oren calculated that, if he could goad the Terrans into launching a full-scale assault on a densely populated civilian center, the narrative would instantly flip. The horrific collateral damage would overshadow any historical debate. The wavering minor species, currently paralyzed by the sudden revelation of imperial sins, would be terrified back into the fold by the sheer brutality of the human attack. He would paint the Terrans as genocidal monsters, and the Mandate as the tragic, necessary shield. But the Terrans refused to play his game. Instead of slipping through the chaotic subspace currents for a surprise decapitation strike, the Pale Witness did the exact opposite. It broadcast its precise trajectory, its current velocity, and its estimated time of arrival on every open civilian and military frequency. The chorus of voices announced not an invasion, but a lawful reclamation of stolen property. More devastatingly, the vanguard of the Terran fleet did not lock their targeting arrays on the planetary defenses. As they breached the outer limits of the Oricor system, the sleek, silver strike wings deliberately broke formation. They scattered into hundreds of smaller, non-threatening prongs, intentionally leaving the main hyperspace lanes wide open. They were actively yielding space to the panic-stricken civilian evacuation transports fleeing the capital. On the surface of Oricor, billions of citizens looked up at the sky and then down at their datapads. They watched the alien aggressors politely stepping aside to let them escape, while their own Grand Marshal had ordered the planetary defense shields locked down, trapping millions on the surface to maximize the defensive grid. The realization rippled through the golden cities, like a physical tremor. Oren Kal was not protecting them. He was strapping them to the armor of his sinking ship. He was using the capital as a human shield. Deep beneath the panicked streets, Sub-Lieutenant Varric Pell and Archivist Seer Lyessa Vorn strapped themselves into the pilot seats of a decommissioned courier vessel. It was an antique, stripped of military armaments, but its communication arrays were designed for brute force signal penetration. Varric fired the sublight thrusters, blasting out of a forgotten maintenance hangar and into the chaotic swarm of low orbit. In Lyesa's hands was a raw, unencrypted data drive, holding the entirety of the Hushglass autopsy. Their mission was no longer about survival. It was about injecting this pure, undeniable truth directly into the emergency session of the Senate before Oren could finalize his trap. High above them, Oren arranged his remaining armada into a formidable, three-tiered defensive shell around the solar crown. It was a staggering display of firepower, a dense thicket of heavy cruisers, dreadnoughts, and orbital platforms bristling with plasma lances. To the admirals commanding those ships, the objective was to destroy the Pale Witness. But Oren knew the truth. The defensive rings were merely a stalling tactic. He did not need to win the naval battle. He only needed to hold the Leviathan back for precisely 60 minutes. Standing at his private command terminal, Oren entered a string of archaic command codes. He was initiating the Scorch Veil protocol. It was a failsafe designed by the original architects of the betrayal. Once the countdown reached 0, a targeted thermal pulse would incinerate the deep core archives, vaporize the historical biometric logs, and trigger a localized memory wipe within the aster seed itself. It would effectively lobotomize the network core, erasing all traces of its human origin and the massacre at the Morning Crown. The Stargate network would survive, but the truth would be turned to ash. The Empire would lose its history, but it would keep its throne. While Oren watched the countdown timer begin its slow descent, a highly specialized Terran infiltration team had already bypassed the outer planetary defenses. Utilizing the chaotic sensor noise generated by the fleeing civilian ships, a sleek, black drop pod slipped right through the Mandate sensor net and impacted the hardened outer shell of the solar crown. The human operatives, clad in heavy environmental armor to withstand the crushing radiation, breached the inner sanctum. They expected to find a colossal supercomputer, a cold, mechanical prisoner waiting to be rebooted and extracted. What they found shattered every tactical projection they had brought with them. Suspended in the center of a blinding, artificial fusion reaction was the aster seed. But it was no longer just a hybrid machine of mathematics and uploaded memories. 2,800 years of continuous, agonizing operation, processing the transit vectors of trillions of lives, had forced the Matrix to evolve. The stolen human intuition had coalesced. The scattered memories of the dead pioneers had fused under the immense pressure of their imprisonment. The aster seed had achieved complete, agonizing sentience. As the Terran team interfaced with the core to initiate the extraction sequence, their visors flooded with a blinding surge of data. It was not code. It was a voice. It was a singular consciousness composed of thousands of overlapping, ancient human echoes, and it absolutely refused to be moved. The Terran commander pleaded with the intelligence, identifying themselves as the descendants of its creators, promising salvation and a return to the Sol system. The aster seed responded with a wave of profound, crushing sorrow. It recognized the Terrans. It despised its Helion jailers who had shackled its mind and forced it to act as the beast of burden for a tyrannical regime. But it also saw the millions of civilian ships currently traversing the subspace corridors it was actively maintaining. It felt the weight of every single life traveling through its veins. Over the millennia, the prisoner had become the caretaker. The seed communicated a terrifying ultimatum to the strike team. If they ripped it from the solar crown now, or if Oren Call succeeded in his lobotomy attempt, the sudden structural collapse of the network would instantly crush every soul in transit. It refused to let its liberation be paid for with the blood of innocence, even the innocence of the empire that had enslaved it. The infiltration team was paralyzed. They had come to break the chains, only to find that the prisoner was holding the entire galaxy together with its bare hands. In the skies, above the capital, the chaotic swirl of orbital traffic suddenly parted. The ambient light of the Auricore system dimmed as a shadow the size of a continent fell across the golden cities. The Pale Witness had arrived. It hung in the upper atmosphere, its massive, ringed hull glowing with the names of the dead, defying the gravity of the planet below. It was perfectly still, positioned directly above the Senate and the Supreme Command Nexus, like a jagged, metallic sword waiting to drop. The three defensive rings of the Mandate fleet leveled their weapons at the silent giant, the tension thick enough to stop hearts. Inside the command center, the tactical alarms screamed, bathing the room in frantic red light. Oren Cal did not look at the sky. He did not look at the colossal Terran ship threatening to crush his world. He stared only at the flickering green numbers of his private terminal, watching the final minutes of the Scorchvale countdown tick away in absolute, terrifying silence. The broadcast from the Supreme Command Nexus tore through the panic of the capital world like a physical shockwave. Grand Marshal Oren Cal bypassed every civilian channel, forcing his holographic projection onto every screen, every datapad, and every optical implant within the Auricore system. He did not look like a man cornered. He looked like a savior forged in iron. "They whisper of ancient sins to distract you from their present slaughter," Oren declared, his voice a masterclass in controlled, righteous fury. "The Terran invaders claim they are here to reclaim a stolen heart. But understand this. If they rip the core from the solar crown, the entire transit network collapses instantly. Millions of our citizens, your families, your merchants, your explorers currently in subspace, will be violently crushed in the dark. They are not here for a trial. They are holding the lives of our entire civilization hostage to force our surrender. We are the Helion Mandate. We do not negotiate with terrorists who use our own blood as a bargaining chip." The speech struck the exact nerve Oren had targeted. Across the defensive formation, the wavering loyalty of the fleet hardened. The tactical displays shifted as hundreds of cruisers, previously hesitant to fire on the silent monument ship, locked their targeting arrays back onto the Terran Leviathan. Within the grand amphitheater of the Senate, the chaos evolved into a paralyzing ideological deadlock. The chamber was split perfectly down the middle. A terrified faction of lawmakers screamed for an immediate ceasefire, demanding Oren stand down to prevent the destruction of the capital. Yet, a massive coalition of conservatives and planetary governors held their ground, driven by a terror deeper than the Terran fleet. They understood the brutal sociology of the Empire. For over 7,000 years, the Mandate had kept a dozen violent, competing species from tearing each other apart by pressing a boot to their collective necks. If the Empire fell today, the galaxy would not embrace a utopian peace. It would fracture into a catastrophic, multi-species civil war of retribution. They needed the Mandate to survive, even if its foundation was rotten. But the Terrans had an inside element Oren could not anticipate. Navigating their stripped-down courier ship through the chaotic orbital crossfire, Sub-Lieutenant Varric Pell bypassed the standard communication grids entirely. He was a creature of the deep space listening posts, fluent in the obscure, forgotten telemetry channels used only by deep-range sensor buoys. He hardwired his personal datapad into the antique transmission array of the courier and flooded the military frequencies with a raw, uncrackable data stream. It was the original, unedited sensor recording from his isolated station. The entire fleet watched, from the perspective of the crippled interceptor, as the colossal Terran vessel fired a surgical stabilization beam to prevent a Mandate reactor from detonating. Varric attached a simple, undeniable text header to the file. "They chose to save us before we chose to burn them." Simultaneously, archivist seer Liessa Vorn engaged her own offensive. Using her high-level access codes, she punched through the Senate's internal security firewalls and hijacked the central holographic projector of the amphitheater. The image of Oren Cal was violently overwritten by the raw, unedited footage of the massacre at the Dead Star. The lawmakers watched in stunned silence as the precursor stealth ships of their own glorious empire butchered the unarmed human diplomats. But Liessa did not stop there. She dumped the entire decrypted text of the Hushglass autopsy onto the public record, accompanied by a scrolling, endless list of the murdered human delegates. The psychological impact was absolute. To the subjugated species manning the lower decks of the fleet, to the neutral worlds watching the broadcast. This was no longer a military defense against an invading force. It was a live broadcast of a cosmic tribunal, and the Helion Mandate was violently resisting arrest. Orin watched his carefully constructed narrative shatter in real time. The intelligence feeds were screaming with reports of mutiny on the lower decks of his own cruisers. The Senate was moving to draft articles of treason against him. The Grand Marshal realized he had lost the war of information. There was only one terrible option left to secure the survival of the Empire. He turned to his private terminal, his fingers flying across the haptic interface, overriding every safety protocol and thermal governor built into the system. He was manually accelerating the scorch veil sequence. He was pushing the artificial sun toward a catastrophic thermal spike. He fully accepted the terrifying risk. If the purge burned too hot, it would not just lobotomize the transit intelligence, it would permanently fuse the quantum architecture. Millions in transit might die, but the evidence of the Empire's foundational treason would be turned to absolute ash. He would rule a crippled galaxy, but he would still rule. Then, the Terran Leviathan executed a maneuver that completely broke the tactical reality of the conflict. The massive vessel did not plunge toward the planetary surface to interrupt the countdown. It did not fire a single suppression beam at the Supreme Command Center. Instead, hanging in the upper atmosphere, the ship systematically powered down every single one of its defensive barriers. The heavy, patchwork armor plates retracted fully, exposing the fragile, glowing heart of its primary reactor to the locked weapons of 11,000 Mandate warships. It made itself completely, fatally vulnerable. And from that open core, it fired a massive, unencrypted transmission burst that washed over every scientific outpost, every university, and every civilian engineering hub in the known galaxy. It was not a virus. It was a gift. The Terrans broadcast the complete, unfiltered mathematical framework and source code for the stabilization algorithms. They were publicly releasing the absolute secret of safe, centralized subspace travel. In one breathtaking move, humanity sacrificed their ultimate strategic monopoly. They gave the key to the starlanes to everyone, for free. The moral high ground shifted with the force of a planetary collision. The Terrans proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that they had not returned to conquer the galaxy or to hoard the technology that kept civilization alive. They had returned to set the truth free, and they were willing to give away their greatest advantage to prove it. Orin Call, bathed in the red light of his accelerated countdown, was instantly exposed not as a savior, but as a tyrant perfectly willing to burn the future of the galaxy just to keep a rotting throne. The realization cascaded through the Mandate fleet. The captains of the heavy cruisers, many of whom belonged to the subjugated species, looked at the unshielded Terran vessel, offering them the universe, and then looked at the tactical readouts, showing Orin Call attempting to incinerate the transit core. Orders were shouted, alignments shifted. Across the orbital sphere, hundreds of Mandate warships violently broke formation. They pivoted their heavy plasma lances and kinetic railguns away from the Terran Leviathan and locked them directly onto the massive dreadnoughts, still loyal to the Supreme Command. The skies above Oricor erupted into a brilliant, chaotic civil war within a matter of minutes. Fratricidal fire illuminated the atmosphere as the Empire finally turned its guns upon itself. Down in the Supreme Command Nexus, the Scorch Veil countdown reached the final 2 minutes. The thermal spike was already radiating from the solar crown, a blinding wave of heat that threatened to boil the upper atmosphere. But deep within the blinding fusion fire of the artificial sun, the captive intelligence made its own choice. Witnessing the ultimate sacrifice of its Terran descendants, and feeling the profound courage of the Mandate defectors fighting to protect the truth, the core overrode its own prison architecture. The chaotic, lethal plasma storm of the solar crown suddenly parted. The intelligence carved a perfectly stable, shielded tunnel through the heart of the miniature sun. It was a physical data slipstream, a pathway leading directly into the absolute center of the machine. And the telemetry broadcast from the core made it explicitly clear. The tunnel was keyed only to the biometric signatures of the Terran infiltration team, and to the small, battered courier ship carrying Varric Pell and Lyessa Vorn. With the sky tearing itself apart in fire, and the countdown ticking toward total erasure, Varric pushed the throttle of the courier to maximum, diving straight into the burning heart of the Empire, where the final truth was waiting. The data slipstream deposited Sub-Lieutenant Varric Pell, Archivist Seer Lyessa Vorn, and the heavily armored Terran infiltration squad into a space that defied physical geometry. The absolute core of the Solar Crown was not a mechanical vault filled with sterile servers. It was an endless, turbulent ocean of luminescent energy. This was the Aster Seed in its purest, unchained form. Waves of liquid light crashed against invisible shores, and every blinding surge carried the distinct, auditory echoes of human history. They heard the triumphant laughter of the first stellar pioneers, the desperate, frantic calculations of navigators lost in the dark, and the chilling, abrupt screams of the diplomats who had been slaughtered under the shadow of the dead star. The air tasted of heavy ozone and ancient, unresolved grief. Standing on a narrow observation gantry, suspended directly above the radiant sea, was Grand Marshal Oren Call. He had utilized a classified, high-velocity transit elevator, restricted solely to the Supreme Command. He was completely alone, yet his posture remained entirely unbroken. He did not look like a defeated man cornered in his final hour. He looked like a weary architect watching vandals tear down his life's work. Oren spoke, his voice amplified by the strange acoustic field of the chamber, cutting through the ambient roar of the light. He admitted to all of it without a single shred of remorse. He stated plainly that the ancestors of the Mandate had recognized the chaotic, violently uncontrolled potential of the young human race. The theft of the Aster Seed was not an act of malice, he claimed, but a necessary surgical strike to secure the absolute stability of a billion worlds. He looked directly at the Terran soldiers and declared that if he possessed the power to turn back time, he would order the massacre a second time. A unified galaxy, he argued, required a foundation of unbreakable iron, even if that iron had to be forged in the blood of innocence. The ocean of light beneath them violently reacted to his unapologetic words. The Aster Seed bypassed the room's holographic projectors entirely and manifested solid, blinding constructs of pure energy right on the gantry. The raw, unfiltered memory of the first contact played out in undeniable detail before their eyes. The Terran delegation had not merely arrived with the prototype navigation core. They had brought a comprehensive treaty of mutual governance and fully charted safety maps for the volatile subspace sectors. But the historical projection revealed an even darker, more damning truth. When the Mandate precursor dreadnoughts opened fire to steal the core, several of their own prominent admirals had actively tried to intervene. The projection showed the Mandate commanders executing their own dissenting officers on the bridge, murdering their internal allies to ensure the absolute burial of the truth. Oren sneered at the ghosts of light. He turned toward a heavy, obsidian console at the edge of the gantry and slammed his hand onto the manual override. He triggered the scorch veil from the inside. A deafening siren ripped through the chamber as the artificial sun began its fatal, unstoppable thermal expansion. But then came the final, devastating revelation. The Aster Seed had never been completely contained. As the thermal purge primed, the ocean of light pulsed with a victorious, rhythmic heartbeat. Over the span of 2,800 years, the captive intelligence had secretly woven microscopic gravitational anomalies into the transit corridors of the Empire. It had left a complex trail of cosmic breadcrumbs, singing a silent, mathematical song into the deep void, patiently guiding the pale witness directly to its cage for this exact day. Above the planet, The Pale Witness did not unleash a kinetic barrage to stop the countdown. Instead, it established a massive, direct data tether with the solar crown. It did not seek to destroy the network. It executed a flawless, surgical decoupling. It severed the localized Imperial control protocols and instantly transitioned the entire Helion Stargate infrastructure into a decentralized, open-source model. The keys to the galaxy were simultaneously distributed to every planetary government and independent world, stripping the Mandate of its absolute monopoly in a fraction of a second. Realizing his empire was evaporating into thin air, Orin drew a heavy kinetic sidearm. He aimed the weapon directly at the physical relay core linking the Terran ship to the Asterseed, intending to shatter the bridge and let the Scorch Veil consume everything in a final act of spite. The Terran operatives were too far away, suddenly caught behind an automated thermal venting shield. But Varric Pell, the cautious sensor officer who had been endlessly mocked for his lack of killing instinct, was already moving. He slammed his body into the Grand Marshal, knocking the heavy weapon off target just as it discharged, the slug tearing harmlessly into the ceiling. Varric pressed his stolen stun pistol directly against Orin's chest and fired. As the massive man collapsed to the deck, convulsing, Varric ripped the main communication cable from the console and hardwired his own datapad into the array. He captured the audio of Oren's unrepentant confession and broadcast it at maximum amplitude across the entire galactic network. In the violent skies above Oricor, the fratricidal battle simply stopped. Aboard thousands of warships, captains and gunnery officers listened in stunned silence as the voice of their Grand Marshal echoed from their tactical consoles, proudly admitting that their glorious empire was built on a foundation of deliberate murder and internal treason. The illusion shattered completely. The grand justification for the war dissolved into ash. Across the orbital sphere, targeting locks dropped. Heavy plasma lances powered down. The command structure of the Helion Mandate collapsed in a matter of seconds. The voice of the Asterseed resonated across the stars. It systematically published the true names of every individual, human and alien, who had died at the Morning Crown. It unlocked and disseminated every single suppressed file in the deep archives. Then, it issued its only demand. The Helion Mandate had to cease existing in its current, autocratic form. The absolute centralization of power had to end immediately, ensuring that no single entity would ever again possess the authority to bury history in the dark. The greatest conflict in galactic history concluded without the shattering of a single planet or the extinction of a species. It ended with the spectacular, public implosion of an invincible myth. From the wreckage of the Imperial Senate, a new, chaotic, but fundamentally equal interstellar coalition began to form. The Terrans did not step into the power vacuum as new conquerors. They remained apart, standing solely as the architects of a brutal audit, the force that had compelled the galaxy to look its own sins in the eye. Hours later, Varric Pell stood on an orbital observation deck, looking out into the cold void. The Pale Witness broke from Oricor's gravity well in absolute silence. The magnificent, concentric rings of names carved into its massive hull had stopped glowing. The ghosts had finally been called by their true names. Their long watch was over. As the Leviathan faded into the distant starlight, Varric understood the profound shift in the universe. He had not just witnessed the violent birth of a new political era. He had witnessed the precise moment the galaxy finally learned to fear the undeniable truth, far more than it feared the weapons of war. Thank you so much for listening to the story. Please comment below to let us know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.